There's a specific kind of disappointment that only comes from watching a show collapse at the exact moment it was supposed to justify its existence. Spoilers, by the way, for Stranger Things, all 5 seasons. If you haven't seen it yet, don't even bother at this point. I think Stranger Things ended badly because it didn't try hard enough to be anything at all. It wasn't risking anything, and it didn't wrap it up that much either. For nearly a decade, this show has been untouchable. Nostalgia, aesthetic, and cultural timing carried it through weak plotting and bloated runtimes and increasingly thin character work. Each season was excused as a stepping stone to a finale that would make it all worth it, and with more time and more money and more episodes and more lore, the assumption was that scale would eventually become substance. Season 5 is the moment where that excuse ran out. This isn't just me hating on popular things or expecting it to end with everyone killing themselves. It's also not about nitpicking minor inconsistencies or weaponizing the term pothole until it loses all meaning. Plenty of people did that in the first week after the finale aired, and most of it missed the point entirely. The real problem with Stranger Things was structural. Characters stop behaving like people, and stakes are repeatedly introduced and then immediately revoked. Emotional beats are dropped onto scenes without regard for tone, urgency, or consequence, and the show gestures at tragedy while carefully ensuring that nothing truly irreversible ever happens. What makes it worse is that Stranger Things did once understand restraint. The first season worked precisely because it was small and deliberate and uncomfortable. It trusted silence and absence and implication more than spectacle. The horror felt personal because it was allowed to linger. By the time we reached the end of season 5, that understanding is completely gone. This video is about how that happened, how a series began with genuine tension and character-driven storytelling and gradually flattened itself into just noise, and why the season finale didn't just fail to stick the landing, but it also revealed that the plane had been on autopilot for years at this point. The first season of Stranger Things opens very small. Will Byers goes missing, and the story unfolds through 3 parallel threads. The kids searching for their friend, Joyce insisting that her son is communicating with her through the walls, and Hopper doing whatever the fuck he was doing. The supernatural elements are present, but they are restrained. The Upside Down isn't explained in detail, and the Demogorgon is described more than it's shown. Eleven's powers are frightening because they clearly hurt her rather than it being something impressive. Crucially, I think this season is self-contained, and Will is found, and the threat is immediately neutralized. Questions remain, but the emotional arc is resolved. The characters feel like people reacting to an extraordinary situation, not like avatars for future lore. Season 1 works because it understands limitation, and it trusts atmosphere over explanation and consequence over spectacle. Season 2 immediately signals a shift in this. Will has returned, but he's not the same. He's not free. He's still connected to the Upside Down, and now personified through the Mind Flayer, even more so. The town begins to experience rot spreading beneath the surface, and the story widens to include new locations, new characters, and more explicit mythology. Plot-wise, the season revolves around stopping the Mind Flayer's growing influence and severing Will's connection to it. 11 explores her origins and briefly leads Hawkins to discover that there are other people like her before returning in time for the finale. This is the first season where the show starts mistaking more for better, and also why I think that the Duffer Brothers stole the first season. I don't think that's theirs. It can't be. Not all of it fails. Will's arc is effective, and the horror is still grounded in physical and emotional pain, but the narrative starts to sprawl. Subplots appear and disappear without consequence, and the show begins to explain things that were more effective when they were left unknown. Season 2 largely holds together because the emotional core remains intact. Season 3 marks a turning point. Set against the backdrop of a new mall, the show begins to lean heavily into colour and humour and self-awareness, and the Russian subplot is introduced, revealing an international conspiracy that stretches the logic of the setting and drastically raises the stakes. The Mind Flayer returns in a more overly monstrous form, possessing townspeople and turning them into body horror set pieces. Hopper is positioned as a sacrificial figure in the finale, seemingly dying while destroying the Russian machine opening the gate. The season is fun, kind of. It's fast paced and it's stylish, it's Netflixy, it's watchable, but it's also where characterization begins to flatten. People start behaving according to what's entertaining rather than what's believable. Emotional beats are rushed or undercut by jokes, and consequences are implied rather than actually being explored. The show is no longer grounded horror, it's just an event. Season 4 is where the shift becomes impossible to ignore. The series splits across multiple locations of Hawkins, California, Russia, and the Upside Down. A new villain is introduced in Vecna, who targets traumatized kids through psychic visions and elaborate death sequences. Vecna is eventually revealed to be Henry Creel, a former subject of Hawkins' lab and the origins of much of the show's mythology, and the season reframes past events, tying them into a single villain-driven narrative. Individually, many elements work. Vecna is alright, the horror imagery is striking, and some performances are genuinely strong, but structurally, the season is bloated and the episodes stretch past feature-length runtimes. Plotlines run in parallel without urgency, and characters spend long stretches waiting to re-enter the story. Most importantly, the show stops letting events change people in meaningful ways. Trauma becomes aesthetic rather than transformative, and deaths are shocking, but their aftermath is minimal. Like Eddie, who didn't really do much of anything, like he clearly wanted to die, and it didn't really make much of an impact on the story anyway, so it didn't matter. By the end of season 4, Stranger Things has fully committed to being louder and longer and more explicit and just big, and it kind of abandons the discipline that made it compelling in the first place. One of the most frustrating things about Stranger Things is that its biggest failure isn't like narrative complexity or an overload of lore. It's character erosion, I think. Over time, the people at the center of the story stop feeling like individuals shaped by experience and instead become exaggerated versions of themselves. In season 1, the characters are defined by specificity. Mike is anxious and stubborn in a recognizable way. Lucas is skeptical, and often it's to his own detriment, and Dustin is insecure beneath the humor. Hopper is withdrawn and self-destructive, not just like charmingly gruff all the time, and Joyce is frantic because no one believes her, not because like hysteria is a fun personality quirk. As the seasons progress, those traits harden into performance. Dustin becomes the funny one, Steve becomes the babysitter, Hopper becomes the pissy dad, and once a character's role is set, the writing stops challenging it, and they don't grow, they just repeat the same actions over and over again. I think this repetition is why the characters start feeling artificial. They aren't introduced to disrupt dynamics, they are designed to slot neatly into them. Eddie exists almost entirely to be adored and to be tragic and then to be mourned. His death is framed as emotionally significant, but it doesn't meaningfully alter the trajectory of the story. Barb, by contrast, if you even remember her at all, is barely integrated into the story. She exists primarily as a symbol of injustice before being discarded completely. Both cases reveal the same problem. Characters are valued for the reaction they produce rather than the role they play. The shift also exposes these retroactive weaknesses in earlier seasons. While season 1 remains the strongest, it isn't flawless. Its pacing occasionally lags and some emotional beats are simplified, but those issues were excusable in a contained story by new creators. What's harder to excuse is those same problems persist and worsen as the show goes on. How do you get worse with more? You have more money and more experience and more time. How do you get worse? By season 3, emotional moments are immediately undercut by humor, and by season 4, they're stretched so thin that they lose impact entirely. Characters react loudly but briefly to tragedy, and then they reset for the next scene. Trauma becomes a visual motif rather than a catalyst for change. Perhaps the clearest symptom of this is how interchangeable the characters become by the later seasons. They all speak with the same rhythm, the same earnest intensity, and like quippy deflection, and the conversations feel staged rather than spontaneous, as though everyone is waiting for their turn to speak instead of responding to one another. The result is emotional numbness. When everyone is constantly emoting, nothing lands. This is also where audience perception begins to fracture. Viewers latch onto the isolated moments or characters rather than the story as a whole, because the narrative no longer provides a decent and cohesive emotional through line. Fan attachment replaces character development. By the time the show reaches its final season, the groundwork for failure has been laid. Characters are too flattened to carry genuine stakes, too protected to be vulnerable, and too aware of themselves to feel real. Season 5 exposes all of this. The last season positions itself as a culmination of everything Stranger Things has been building up towards: the collapse of the barrier between Hawkins and the Upside Down, Vecna's final stand, and the end of the supernatural threat that has defined the whole series. Season opens in the aftermath of a previous destruction. Hawkins is visibly damaged, and the town is fractured both physically and socially, and the characters are all preparing for what is framed as an inevitable final confrontation. From the outset, the show insists on scale. Uh, this is no longer saving one kid or closing one gate. This is about preventing a total collapse. Vecna remains a central antagonist, fully positioned as the architect behind much of the series' suffering. Will's psychic connection is emphasized early on, like heavily, functioning as both a tracking mechanism and a reminder that the Upside Down has never fully let him go. 11, once again, is framed as the key to stopping Vecna, and with her powers treated as both a weapon and a liability. The season unfolds through prolonged set pieces and extended episodes, culminating in a multi-location final battle. Kind of. Characters are repeatedly placed in mortal danger only to narrowly survive. Sacrificial moments are teased and reversed and then teased again. Emotional climaxes are delayed in favor of spectacle, and there's a hell of a lot of Holly Wheeler, even though I didn't give a shit about her before, so why should I now? Eventually, Vecna is defeated, the Upside Down threat recedes, and the world does not end. It's that simple. The surviving characters, which is all of them, are given epilogues that gesture towards normalcy, relationships stabilize, futures are implied, and the life in Hawkins resumes as a recognizable form. Despite the apocalyptic framing, the ending is fundamentally restorative rather than transformative. The story closes on reassurance rather than loss or rupture. It is important that I state this, otherwise people are just gonna say I'm a hater. I'm not a hater. I'm a little bit of a hater. Little bit. Not everything in the season fails. The most consistently effective element is Vecna's human origin story. The exploration of Henry, his childhood and eventual transformation, adds texture to a villain who might otherwise have remained a purely symbolic threat. The idea that the Upside Down's horror is rooted in a human impulse rather than an unknowable cosmic force is conceptually strong. This is helped enormously by Jamie Campbell-Bower's performance, which remains one of the few in the season that feels fully committed without tipping into exaggeration. Even when the writing falters, which it does most of the time, he maintains a sense of internal logic and menace that grounds the scenes that he's in. There's also merit in the idea of the ending each surviving character receives. Taken in isolation, many of these resolutions are coherent. If the show insists on keeping most of its cast alive, or all of it, all of them, their eventual trajectories, relationships continuing, authority figures settling into domestic roles, young characters looking towards adulthood, it provides a form of closure. The problem is not that these endings exist, but that they arrive without sufficient cost. Visually, the season remains impressive too. The production design, effects work, and horror imagery are polished and confident enough. The show looks expensive and deliberate and controlled. Besides, arguably the most important scene of the big, mind flayer thing, looks like absolute shit. I think all of that is part of the issue as well, because while the season succeeds on a technical level and delivers moments that function individually, it struggles to make those moments accumulate into meaning. The foundations are there: a compelling villain, a clear end goal, and characters with shared history, but the execution prioritizes reassurance over consequence, and I think that's where the problems begin. The most immediately obvious problem with the final season is its pacing. Not because it's slow, but I think because it's indulgent. Length is treated as a substitute for weight, and episodes stretch towards feature-length film runtimes under the assumption that duration alone creates significance. It doesn't. Scenes are allowed to run way far past the point where they delivered new information or emotional development, and characters reiterate the same fears and the same motivations and the same reassurances, often within the same episode. Instead of escalation, the story plateaus. This is particularly damaging in a narrative framed as the end of the world. Apocalyptic storytelling relies on momentum, the sense that events are slipping out of the character's control. Here, everything feels strangely managed. People pause and they regroup and they wait their turn to speak, and urgency is replaced by organization, which is insane for a bunch of 15-year-olds in an end of the world situation. I don't think they would be that organized. The result is a season that feels rushed and bloated at the same time, rushed in its resolution and bloated in its execution. Major arcs conclude abruptly after hours of narrative stalling, and minor emotional beats are stretched far beyond their natural lifespan. The final season also constantly signals danger without ever committing to it. Characters are placed in situations that should be fatal and framed as final and scored as tragic, only for the narrative to immediately reverse course. Fake out deaths become the dominant storytelling tool. Steve almost dies, and then he doesn't. Eleven appears to die, and then the show refuses to let anyone react as if she has, except for Mike, who just straight up becomes suicidal. Sacrifice is teased repeatedly, and then revoked just as often. I think this completely destroys trust in your audience. Once they realize that survival is guaranteed, the tension completely collapses. You stop watching what happens and start waiting for how it will be undone, and I think that's just conditioning rather than engagement. Even worse, these reversals have no lasting impact on the characters. Near-death experiences don't change behavior or relationships or priorities. They exist only to create momentary spikes of emotion before the story resets. And I think this is what leads to the central issue of nothing costing anything. For a story about trauma and loss and consequence, the final season is deeply resistant to permanence. Injuries heal, relationships stabilize, and death is almost entirely avoided. Everyone graduates. Even Max, who was in a coma and didn't really go to school anyway, she graduates. Hopper and Joyce get married, they play D&D again, and we skipped way too far ahead to see anything of substance. When consequences do appear, they are so abstract, they're folded into vague future implications rather than present reality. The world nearly ends, but the ending insists on restoration rather than transformation. This is narratively incoherent. If the stakes are genuinely apocalyptic, survival should come at a price. The price doesn't have to be nihilistic, but it does have to be real. Instead, the show opts for reassurance. Everyone important is still here, and also Brett Gelman. They're still whole, they're still able to move forward largely unchanged, and the story wants the emotional credit of catastrophe without actually paying for it. A lot of the early criticism of the finale fixated on so-called plot holes, which many were not actually plot holes at all. Unanswered questions or dropped side characters are not, by definition, plot holes. They are not narrative contradictions. People asking where Dustin's girlfriend is, that's not a plot hole, idiot. That's not a plot hole. It doesn't matter. She doesn't change the story in any way. The real structural failures, though, are harder to ignore. The most glaring example is Will's psychic connection to Vecna. This relationship is positioned as central. They can sense each other and they can affect each other and communicate through each other, and the connection drives major decisions and is treated as a fundamental rule of the story. When Vecna is defeated, that connection just vanishes. It goes. There's no fallout, and there's no damage, and there's no explanation for it, and Will is fine. That is a plot hole, because it violates an established cause and effect relationship, not because it's unexplained lore. The story sets rules and relies on them and then abandons them when they become inconvenient. This pattern repeats through the season. Mechanics are introduced for tension and then ignored once the tension has served its purpose. By the final season, nearly every character speaks with the same voice. They share the same emotional cadence, the same rhythms of dialogue, and the same patterns of reassurance and resolve. Conversations feel staged rather than reactive, and instead of responding to one another, characters appear to be waiting for their designated emotional moment. This makes scenes feel really calm, even when the narrative insists that they're dire. Individual traits of like skepticism or fear, impulsiveness, moral disagreement are smoothed out entirely in favor of collective earnestness. Conflict within the group is minimal and short-lived and rarely unresolved, and as a result, it becomes difficult to care who survives. Which is all of them, by the way, they all lived. Not because the audience is cruel, but I think because the characters no longer feel distinct enough for their loss to matter in different ways. There's a recurring issue in the final season where emotionally intimate moments are inserted into scenes that demand urgency. Personal revelations occur in the middle of crises without altering the behavior of anyone involved. The problem isn't the content of these moments, I think it's the timing. When the world is ending, and the narrative treats the ending as immediate, characters should behave accordingly. Instead, the show repeatedly pauses catastrophe to deliver individual arcs, then resumes as if nothing has shifted, like Will's coming out scene. Sure, it was bound to happen at some point, but we really did not have time for that. This undermines both the emotional beat and then the crisis surrounding it. For a bit, for like I say a week, but it's still happening. It's like the 20th of January and it's still happening. There is a belief that there must be a hidden extra episode, or 3 at this point. People think there will be 3 extra episodes to resolve lingering issues, and I don't think that's some fan entitlement thing. I think it means that the narrative failed to signal completion. Stories end when they feel finished, and it just didn't feel finished. If an audience assumes that more is coming, I think it's usually because consequences haven't landed and arcs haven't resolved and cause and effect feels incomplete. The finale doesn't feel like an ending because it refuses to close any doors. Fixing the final season of Stranger Things wouldn't have required reinventing the show or discarding its emotional core. The problem was never a lack of material, they just completely lacked commitment, and nearly every major failure of the finale can be traced back to the same impulse, which is the refusal to let consequences be permanent, and a better ending begins with accepting loss as a narrative necessity rather than a threat. The cast is too large and too protected. The story repeatedly gestures towards sacrifice while kind of stepping away at the last possible moment. This undermines not just the tension, but also the theme. For example, when Vicky and Robin are in the hospital and the demo dogs are coming for them, Robin goes, "They're not here for us." And then they go past them and rip up the soldiers instead, even though Robin was closer. What is that? Plot armor. It's ridiculous. Steve is the clearest example, from shallow antagonist to reluctant protector to emotional anchor. He has always been about responsibility. A meaningful death for him would not have been shocking for the sake of it. I think it would have been coherent. Narratively, it would have worked. Not like a random fall or a background casualty, but like a deliberate act of protection that saves the younger characters at a critical moment would have worked. The same applies to Hopper. His story has always revolved around grief and second chances, and letting him die in a final act of saving Elle would have completed his growth. He doesn't need another domestic ending, he needed closure, and I don't think they've known what to do with Hopper for the past 3 seasons anyway, so it might have worked better if he just died. Eleven's powers are treated as both miraculous and traumatic, yet the show consistently avoids lasting consequences. A more honest ending would have acknowledged that defeating Vecna requires sacrifice beyond physical danger. If Vecna falls, Eleven should also lose her powers. I think killing her off was dumb. She was the only person they killed, and it was dumb. She didn't, she was, she died, but it didn't really mean anything at all. It didn't leave any lasting effect on anyone. It didn't change how the story ended. She just died for no fucking reason. This isn't about nerfing a character, it's just it needs a narrative balance, and the supernatural should not exit the story without taking something with it. Eleven losing her abilities reframes her entire arc, and she is no longer defined by what she can do, but who she is without it. It also allows the show to end on something resembling normalcy that feels earned. The most egregious missed opportunity in the finale is Will. His connection to the Upside Down and to Vecna is treated as foundational and then erased without consequence. Vecna is defeated. Will should not be fine. He doesn't need to die, but he does need to carry some sort of damage, like psychological or physical or neurological. Incapacitation or loss of autonomy or permanent alteration would acknowledge the years of possession and psychic exposure he's endured. If the franchise absolutely requires a continuation, that is where it belongs. Will become something that is unresolved, and I think that is probably much better than whatever they're gonna do with those kids in that spin-off. I don't want to watch that. It looks shit. As I said before, Henry's backstory is one of the stronger elements of the season, but it falters by over-explaining his evil. By confirming that Henry was always inclined towards cruelty, I think the narrative removes ambiguity and emotional tension. A better approach would avoid redemption without completely eliminating complexity. Vecna doesn't need to turn against himself or be saved, but a moment of hesitation I think would have been enough. Not to absolve him, but to remind the audience that the horror originated in something human and therefore tragic. Ambiguity is way more unsettling than certainty, I think. The final season needed less dialogue and more disorder. Like, overall, I think that's probably one of the worst parts of it. Characters should interrupt each other and make mistakes and panic and fail, and conversations should be incomplete and plans should fall apart. You had 12 hours of TV and everything worked out perfectly fine. The apocalypse is inconvenient. It should feel inconvenient. His tonal shift alone would have restored urgency without changing the plot at all. End of the world storytelling only works when the world feels like it's out of control and the characters are genuinely in situations that they're stuck in. Also, I think they should have killed Nancy and Jonathan in that weird slime room thing. That would have been their best decision, and then I'd have no complaints. This show needed to accept that the ending closes doors. Stranger Things began as a story about loss and fear and the terror of the unknown, and it should have ended the same way. Instead, it chose reassurance and the ability to make as many spin-offs as they like. I don't think it's rooted in bad ideas or like a lack of talent. I think is rooted in a fear of consequence and a fear of alienating audiences and a fear of letting the story end in a way that can't be undone. What makes this so frustrating is that the show once understood exactly what it was doing. The first season succeeded because it was restrained and it was uncomfortable and it was willing to let this shit linger. It trusted the audience to sit with this uncertainty rather than immediately rushing to reassure them that everything is fine. And by the final season, that trust is completely gone. Instead of escalation, the story opts for inflation, and instead of consequence, it offers reversibility. Characters are placed in danger repeatedly, and then nothing changes. There's momentarily an exciting part to watch for the audience, and then it's restored to the status quo. The result is exhausting. It is not cathartic. It's just so boring. Everyone survives, and the tone is so hopeful. I think the tone makes everyone survive at this point. The world always ends, but it remains completely recognizable and basically unchanged. You're telling me this big, supernatural, like, disgusting looking being thing that can control people's minds and kill them and open portals in our world and then connect it to a different world which is connected to another different world. He's holding kids hostage and he is making a plan to end the world, and nothing changes in any of that. Nothing looks different at all. Stranger Things chose to protect itself, its characters, and its brand and its future rather than confront the implications of its own story. In doing so, it revealed that the emotional stakes it had been gesturing towards for years were never there, like, at all. Everyone's fine. This doesn't erase what worked. The early seasons still exist. The performances and the atmosphere and the initial tension are still worth revisiting. Finale reframes the entire series as a prolonged exercise in deferral, but then again, I'm not 13 years old and the show wasn't made for me, so what do I know?